Welcome to this edition of What Happens Next, the YouTube channel and podcast, where we talk to people who are insightful about the area of our lives where we're making transition. Now, traditionally, that might have been called retirement. For a lot of my clients, they're not ready to hang up their boots just yet, and the nature of retirement is changing. So when I was thinking about a better phrase for it, what happens next sprung to mind. But the good news is we've got a real retirement expert on as our guest today, who I know is going to give us fantastic insights. Dan, how are you getting on, mate?
Chris, pleasure. Thanks for the intro. Yeah, retirement expert is great. It's lovely to be called an expert in something. I don't know whether I'm an expert, but I do a lot of work in that area, as you do, and I can't wait to have this conversation.
It does start in the back of the book.
But I know. Correct. Yeah. Exactly. Well, you kind of have to big yourself up, don't you? You have to kind of say something about yourself. So, listen, I think it's going to be great.
So do I. You know what's interesting though? I think the element, the more that I do this sort of work, and I think it's in any area of our lives, the more you do, the more you also realize you don't know. Is that your experience? And how do you square that circle of being an expert but realizing where the gaps are?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's why, you kind of write the word expert in a book to try and get people to realize that that you are qualified to say something about this. But I mean, I don't think, in my whole life, actually, I've never settled. I don't think I'm ever going to feel like I've done anything, because I still feel like every opportunity to learn is an opportunity to grow, is an opportunity to, challenge our thoughts and what we think. And every client meeting that I have, every conversation I have like this, every book I read, every podcast, the challenge I have is to not change everything wholesalely every time I do something, right? Yeah. It's kind of that's the challenge I have, because I learn stuff all of the time. And so I think it's that balance of having a real clear thought process about your own beliefs, but also not be closed off enough to kind of feel like you're never really right, and there's always something to learn and to interpret and to get out into the world.
And I think that's an element that we're going to be talking about quite a lot during this interview, because you think about the journeys that we help our clients on. How often is it trying to work out what that next chapter is through a process of not wholesale change, but incremental experimentation? What do we need to do to experiment? But before we start talking about all of that sort of stuff, and I know who you are, and thank you for sending me your brilliant book, which I'm halfway through at the minute. Tell our audience all about you.
Yeah, so I'll go right far back to, and I won't bore everybody, but I'm Dan, and I'm a failed cricketer. I think I have to get used to that, right? Cricket's my first passion and my first love. That's kind of what I wanted to do. When I realised I wasn't quite as good as Sir Alistair Cook or Ravi Bopara, I had to change tact and do something else. But listen, I've been on or worked in financial services now for near on 20 years, worked in financial advisory space, i.e. working with financial advisors and being a financial planner myself, pretty much for most of that time. I made the jump from corporate career into running and owning this business 7 years ago. And actually, Chris, I say to people, right, that was, where was I, 35, 36 at the time. I say to people, I've done a retirement. Actually, I'm coming at this from a thing where I left a really well-paid corporate job that delivered no purpose. I had no affinity to it. Money was great, but money felt quite dirty to me, if that makes sense, because it had no attachment to it. I didn't have a particularly great relationship with it from that point of view. The family life wasn't particularly good because I was traveling everywhere. And so I made a conscious decision at kind of 35 to go, well, I don't want this life. I feel like there's a better way for me to live, to give back, to have purpose, to, earn the money that I needed to earn. I went through a really kind of tough couple of years in terms of losing connections, losing an identity, losing that purpose I had to recreate something for myself, and be where I am today. So a lot of what I say and do is absolutely baked in people that are, at the retirement transitional age, but it's coming from a point that actually I don't think there's that much difference from some of the loss and grief that I had during that big transition that I went through when I left corporate world and decided to do something like this.
I think the interesting, I think you're right. I think the what happens next moment doesn't only happen once in our lives. It can happen quite often. But also yes, there's fundamental differences between what happens next in your mid-50s compared to in your early 30s, but there's also reoccurring themes. And I think, because I was 32, I'm 48 now, but I remember I was 32 when I set Savello up, although it wasn't called Savello at the time, but when I set my business up. And I remember the read. I'm fascinated about sort of what your insight is on this. But I remember I was working for a big corporate, really decent, as you say, really decent, well-paid, secure job in the city, and they've got a guy who does murals to come into the office and paint their values on this wall. And I looked at those values one day and went, I don't believe that. They don't believe that. They've gone through the motions in this office of like 150 people, decided that that's what they're going to aspire to do, and went home to Cass, my wife, and I said, I think I need to try and fail potentially, but just try and set a business up. She went, "Don't! You're mad. Why would you leave a job?" I went, "Look, if I give it a go, a couple of years, we've got the money. If I give it a go, a couple of years, we can go back." And I thought Charlotte, who's now 21, at the time was 6. I remember her being upstairs in the house and me, Dan, going up and going, thinking she'd be excited, and she's Dad's biggest fan, going, "Charlotte, Dad's leaving his job and starting a business," and she burst into tears. And I went, "Oh God, what have I done? What have I done?" And she just looked at me, Dan, and went, "Dad, who's going to pay for the holidays now?" But you know what? It was an interesting 2-year journey after that, because and I don't know if this was your experience as well. There were times of real severe doubt in that early years, when I thought, have I made a massive mistake? And interestingly, when I'm helping people through that retirement journey, I see those elements of doubt, but in different ways. What do you think?
100%. I mean, you may not have got to it in the book yet, or you may, but there's a section in there that I've got that I call the retirement reinvention curve, and it's a bit where what I've done is try to take the emotional journey of retirement, but I've basically used inspiration from 2 sources. One, the kind of the life in transitions work that Bruce Felly has done, and there's a whole, there's a lot of work done on life in transitions, and also the Kubler-Ross change curve of grief. Now, there's that change curve of grief was developed by, I don't know their first names, 2 ladies, Mrs. Kubler and Mrs. Ross, who looked at the emotional journey that people go through when they lose someone, like in terms of someone close to them passes away. And I looked at those 2 things, and I've chatted to Dr. Riley Moynes as well, who's done his famous TED Talk and the 4 phases. And I'm thinking there's a real interesting pattern going on here. And so I've created this as kind of 3 stages, 3 phases, 8 stages that people go in. And it's not like a linear curve, right? It's not a kind of, you go through every stage in a thing. People hit different points at different times and come back a couple. But the reason I'm saying this is because doubt is in there. Now, doubt to me is the lowest ebb that people get to in a transition or in that loss phase. Now, in the Kubler-Ross change curve of grief, the lowest point is depression. And I do think that doubt and depression phase, I mean, retirement, the stats out there are saying that people in retirement are 40% more likely to get clinically diagnosed with depression than if you're not, right? It's a huge time of loss, upheaval, transition, as we've talked about. And so, yeah, I think, you go through these different phases where you might have, you might have some elation in there because you're through that honeymoon phase. You might start feeling a bit uneasy or frustrated. You then might have some doubts about what you have. And like you said, what's really interesting, I'd done the same thing to my wife. I said, look, I've got a decent name in the industry. If this doesn't work out, I'll go back, right? And it's the same people in retirement. They kind of get to that doubt phase. And actually, that's when the majority of people go, I'm just going to go back to work because I don't really like it. But it's a thing I know really well. It gives me a lanyard. I've got a bit of identity in a business card. I've got a reason to pull back the duvet. I'd rather be a little bit miserable, but know what I'm doing. And that's what a lot of people feel. They get into that phase. So, and what I try and say to people is give them the truth, right? I think everybody, no matter how well prepared you are for what happens next, what retirement looks like, this transition, at some point there will be doubt that you will have. Have you made the right decision? Is my relationship with my wife or my husband going in the right direction? Have I got enough to do? Am I being healthy enough? You'll have all these doubts that are sitting in. And you got to learn to realize that that's perfectly normal. I think people beat themselves up too much about having them. It's just part of our emotional journey that we go through when we have transitions and when we have loss and when we're making, big life changes. We've never had this opportunity ever in our lives to control our destiny in the way that we can when we hit this retirement or next phase of life. So it's overwhelming for people.
I agree, and I think that grief is a great word for it. And I think the Kubler-Ross change curve gives real insight in terms of that journey, because it may not be grief of an individual, but it's grief potentially for a lot of people that we work with of their change in identity and the role that they played in that previous aspect of their lives. I'd be really interested in thinking, and I've completely gone off tangent with the questions I've sent you already, but let's go with it. I'd be really interested in your insights based on the research you've done, but also with the practical work you do with clients on how to manage that transition. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think preparedness and it is one of them, right? Look, I just don't think the vast majority of people understand how much work needs to go into preparing for this phase of life, and don't do enough preparing, if that makes sense. So I also think, and again, I'm not outspoken about this, but I'm very, very vocal as a financial planner that deals with numbers to suggest that retirement is not as much to do with numbers as what people think it is. And so there's too much focus on spreadsheets, too much focus on optimizing numbers. And that's the easy thing to focus on. And that's why people do it. And they don't focus on what they're retiring to. They focus on what they're retiring from. And also I add in there, they don't actually focus on what they're retiring with, i.e. that build-up phase. Am I taking stuff with me? Am I taking healthy stuff with me into this new phase of life? So people can make this transition easier by focusing and doing some pretty hard yards on themselves, not focusing so much on the money, although it's important, obviously, to understand that, a really good financial plan can take away a lot of that financial fear and anxiety that you will have with money. But you need to work on what that looks like. And my kind of ratio would be, I think in the 3 years leading up to retirement, you should be at least 60 to 70% focusing on the non-financial side of retirement, building new connections, building your new life, understanding what your relationship with your spouse or your kids or your grandchildren is going to be, understand what the things you want to do within the first 2 or 3 years of retirement, get really comfortable with your numbers, these kind of things that, we really need to work on. And people just sleepwalk into it. So, it's in our hands, Chris, right? I mean, it's, we can as individuals take agency over this and go, we can do a lot of the work to prepare ourselves to be able to transition. But it's hard. And as you and I know, the brain is not particularly, doesn't like hard work. It doesn't like consuming calories. It will get the shortcut path of least resistance. And then what happens is people then just go, do you know what? As long as the numbers say I'm okay, then I'm okay. And that's the path of least resistance that they take.
So I had really interesting conversation today about this. And I was talking to a friend of mine, runs a decent sized law practice in our part of the world. And we were talking about the fact he's been sort of watching the stuff we've been doing with What Happens Next. And he's going through his own mid-50s, going through his own What Happens Next journey. And he said to me, the reason that he believes people focus on the numbers and ignore the rest is because, and I'd be interested in your insight on this, is because the numbers are tangible and the rest, he struggles with it because he feels that he can't. It's a messy middle, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? How many friends is right, and how many what does purpose mean? Those questions are a deeper dive.
Yeah, they're fluffy, right? They're fluffy questions, effectively. Yeah. The way that I try and frame it is when I say that, retirement is more of a human problem than a maths problem. And what I like mean by that really is that it's more of a complex problem than a complicated problem. So, what we tend to do is focus on the things that are tangible, and that is complicated problems can be solved. Right. So human beings like certainty. We hate uncertainty. We hate surprises. And so we run away from them. So what we like to do is create certainty. And you and I know that a financial plan has no certainty in it. It's a forward-looking, prediction of future stuff. But it's a great guide. But there's no one's financial plan goes to plan, right? Because life gets in the way.
I mean, I always quote the great modern philosopher Mike Tyson when he said, "All plans are great until you get punched in the face."
Yeah, exactly.
That element of the planning, as we know, is important, and the process of planning to give clarity as a snapshot is great. But my financial plan hasn't gone to plan. Nobody's will, but you then get to tack, don't you? You get to then.
Exactly. And I think that's where, when I talk about complicated versus complex, this is the one thing I'd get everybody to really start to drill down. As I said, and it comes down to the way that we perceive numbers and stories. So we've got effectively two sides to our brain. One likes numbers, the other one likes stories, without getting too technical. And the trouble with the one that likes numbers is the one that likes numbers is very skeptical. It doesn't believe them. It doesn't, it's really, it challenges itself. The one that likes stories is the one that has that, the other side of that coin. And so if we think about trying to solve a complicated problem, a bit like building a bit of IKEA furniture, right? You've got a set of instructions. You might have one or two missing screws, but ultimately, if you get all the parts out, you follow the instructions, you bang the things in where they need to go, you should end up with a piece of furniture. A complex problem. I've got two teenage daughters, 17 and 14. They are a complex problem. It's unsolvable. It's constant chaos. It's constant reinvention and doing things. That's what retirement is. It's a complex, never-ending loop that has, you need to get comfortable with uncertainty. You need to get comfortable with flexibility. And the human brain just shies away from that because it's still stuck in the prehistoric times, and it doesn't like dealing with that stuff. So, I think that's how I would absolutely frame it for people. Get comfortable with complexity. You need to have some complicated problems solved, but that's not what 70% of retirement is.
What do you think the first practical, like if somebody's thinking about this, watching this interview today and going, I'm on my financial plan, I've got a financial plan, or I'm looking at all of the complicated problems that I need to solve. I've just started thinking about the complex problems. What's the first practical step they can take today to take them down that road?
Yeah, I think there's the very first thing is, I think, purpose. So figure out what you're retiring to that will give you purpose to pull back the duvet in the morning, not just to pull back the duvet to go on holiday for 3 weeks. It's that, what will give you purpose to pull back the duvet at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning on December the 1st when it's cold. You don't need big purpose. You don't need to kind of solve world hunger. What you do need is foundational reasons to make sure you get out of bed and have purpose in your life to do things. And so that would be the number one thing, because for people that live in or that work in corporate world, particularly, purpose has been spoon-fed to them. They may not like the purpose, but they've got a reason to get up in the morning. They've got and a full calendar. So you need to kind of make sure you replace that purpose. That's the first thing, not the most important. I don't really want to go there, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, I love that, and I think the interesting thing as well is, my two girls are 13, 21. And when I think about the purpose in this phase of my life, and it's evolving as we speak, because it does gradually, and because of the work I'm doing, it's evolving. The element of purpose comes from making sure that my family's looked after. Purpose in our early midlives and younger lives are inbred with family commitment, and that evolves over time, right?
Yeah, and I think that's, what is your purpose when no one loves you? That's the question to answer, right? It's, there'll be a point when, if you've got children, they'll be gone. You won't have that full calendar and that, as I said, that kind of inbox. You won't have someone saying, Chris, can you be at this meeting at 3:30 on a Tuesday to talk about this, right? The time is yours. What is your purpose when no one is asking anything of you? You have to intentionally fill it with stuff that you actually want and like to do. And that sounds wonderful, and it sounds like everyone's dream, but the vast majority of people just get paralyzed by choice. They have no idea because they've not done the work, and they end up doing nothing, and it becomes a real challenge for people.
Yeah, no, so interesting. I like the model. I interviewed a guy called John Dunkley on What Happens Next a few months ago, and we talked about that ancient Greek definition of well-being, it being in 3 component parts. So the hedonistic well-being, just doing stuff we love and like with people we love and like. The charonic well-being, experiencing awe, and for me that's being in nature or looking at the stars, but the bit in the middle, that eudaimonia well-being, where we're thinking about meaning and purpose, is often the one that people have a gap in. And what I loved about what I've read about the book so far, and I'm completely with you on this, Dan, is that perception that retirement's all sitting at. If I have got to look at another photo of a couple sitting on a bench overlooking a beach, that is my lived experience of helping my clients. That's not enough, right?
I know. Yeah. And look, listen, and how many pictures do we see of that still? The financial, let's define you and I as in the, we're in a profession, right? I think we know that. There is a wider industry that sits out there from the financial perspective. How often do you see these brochures of people skipping down a beach in white linen with a Labrador bounding behind them, or they're sitting on a ship with a glass of wine in hand, etc. And it's really interesting, actually. I'm building, I do quite a bit of speaking, and there's a keynote talk that goes with my book. I kind of talk about it, and there's one slide in there, and I've asked ChatGPT to create me a Netflix poster for a stereotypical retirement, and it is brilliant. It's a couple of white linen on a beach with a cocktail, smiling, and it is so funny. But that's not reality, isn't it? And I think that's what the problem is. The more that people see that, the more that they think that's it, and the more that they don't do it or don't want to do it, the more they think they might not be doing it properly, right? And it's kind of, this phase of life is much more foundational than that. It's much more it's much more about meaning and purpose. And the other thing, Chris, just to mention without me rabbiting on loads here, is I think one of the most important things is identity, kind of who you are. I think is crucial for people to figure out, and actually could rival purpose in its kind of first thing to think, particularly for successful people that have been in a career for a long time where their identity is so wed to their job title that there could be some real challenges in stepping back and losing that identity. We talked about the change curve of grief. It's grief in loss, isn't it? That's what it is. It's the loss of so many things that we have: identity, relationships, purpose, structure, all of that stuff, wages, salary. There's a huge amount of loss in this transition. And that's why I think that's a really important part of it.
I mean, I remember, Dan, a conversation I had with a client, and this conversation, as a lot of our chats do, lasted for about 3.5 years. So he came to us, said, I want to understand whether I'm financially independent. We did the work and said, based on the assumptions we've used to build a cash flow, you're fine. He said, great. I said, well, what's the next step for you? And he went, well, I'm gonna think about exiting from. He was a managing director of a construction company. I'm thinking about exiting the business. And we checked in on him on a relatively regular basis. But in the following year, we sat down with him, and I said, what's changed? And he said, I'm just carrying on doing what I'm doing. I was like, okay, just whenever you're ready, we'll have the conversation about transitioning from what you're doing now to what's next. He went, yeah, I'll be really up for that. So great. Following year, he came back, and he was still in the same position he was when he asked us about financial independence a couple of years ago. And I said to him, Dan, Steve, I'm missing something here. Like, there's a gap between what you're telling me and what you're actually doing. And I'm always fascinated when that gap occurs. So what am I missing in this conversation that I don't know that you know that I'd love to understand what the gap is? And he looked at me dead in the eye and went, Chris, what am I if I'm not that? And that was it. That was it. What am I if I'm not that MD of a construction business? What am I if I'm not this guy who is valuable and useful and doing something productive? And interestingly, that insight then allowed him to start thinking about what he could be if he wasn't that.
Yeah.
But he sort of had to admit that to himself first, right?
Yeah.
And that's tough.
Yeah. And that's, as I said, that kind of admission is the first stage in a lot of transition, isn't it? Right. If you want to, it's that. I mean, I think the productivity thing is really interesting because, modern society has created kind of a sense of self-worth with productivity, right? The more productive we are, the busier we are, the fuller our inbox, the fuller our calendar. I think we've lost what it means to rest. We've lost what it means to think. We've lost what it means to have space. And it's a real problem for people entering into the second half of life when they're thinking about retirement and what happens next, to kind of go, well, actually, productivity is equaled money, is equaled promotions, is equaled success, is equaled this, is equaled that. And there's a thing about in the book where I call kind of productivity guilt, right? It's kind of, you end up this thing where you've now got nothing to do and you feel guilty because you've got nothing to do, when in fact it should be celebrated that you've got nothing to do, and you should be able to feel comfortable in plotting your own life and not having it spoon-fed into you. Now, I'm not saying that, a lot of people love what they do, and I think continuing to work on their terms is the right thing for them. But I would imagine the vast majority of people will go, do you know what, if I could go down to 2 or 3 days a week, that would be great. Or if I could set up some consulting business to have my own work completely on my terms to give me 2 or 3 months off a year, that would be great. And they just don't explore those things because, again, it's kind of, who am I if I'm not that? And so I think it's, again, it's a real challenge for people to admit that they've got to do that work because they've never had to do it. It's brand new for us, right? Brand new.
I agree. And I actually think the interesting thing is that the potential definition of work in our next stage is really broad, because it could be I'm granddad, or it could be I'm a charity trust. The depth, it doesn't need to be about I'm productive in the way that I might have conventionally been in that stretch of my career. One thing I really loved is your podcast with Thomas, from Dr. Tom from Aegon, which I listened to last week in preparation for our interview. And you spoke a lot about spending money as a skill. And I agree. We've probably both got clients who have had certain habits to accumulate wealth, but really struggle on the other side. Tell me a bit about that. And I suppose the big question for me is, how do we get better at practically spending money in our retirement phase?
Yeah. I think we could spend probably another 2 hours talking about this. This fascinates me, both from a real kind of lived human behavior point of view, lived and observed behavior point of view, as well as the psychology that sits behind it. But yeah, right. We have been taught to save our money. That's, and in fact, people over the last 30 or 40 years have been very much taught to save their money. We've had, nudges to auto-enrollment into pension funds. It's, save and rainy day and all of that stuff. So we've been taught to save. Also, we've conditioned ourselves to understand what saving does for us. It provides us with a sense of security. It provides us with a sense of peace of mind that we're protecting our future selves, right? We're kind of saving for a future date. It gives us a sense of wealth, a peace of mind, etc. So the way I kind of liken it is, it's a bit like spending 30 years building the most beautiful sandcastle you've ever built, and then being told to trample it all down intentionally, right? You'd feel really sad about doing that. It would give you a lot of bad feelings. And again, we all know, we talked about loss earlier on. There's a lot of research around our behaviors that losses hurt twice as much as gains give us pleasure. So that's loss aversion. And we don't like losses as human beings. And so we see depleting our wealth as a sense of loss. I come across people that I work with quite a lot, and I talk to them about, just plant the seeds about the challenge of spending money. And they go, oh, no, we're fine. Don't worry, Dan. We're good spenders. We can spend money. And I'm like, well, not really. And they go, what do you mean? I'm like, well, what you can spend is income, right? And guess what happens to that income next month? It's coming back in. So the psychological challenge of spending money is not a problem if it's going to be replaced. It is a massive problem if the whole intention is not to replace it. So it's a skill that I think we absolutely need to learn. It's one that needs to be learned quickly, because in order to, increase our memories, I call it about memory dividends, and increase our experiences and our joy when we're living our retirement, we need to learn to spend our money. We need to learn to spend it wisely. We need to learn to spend it on stuff that gives us intrinsic benefits, not extrinsic benefits. So stuff that's really important to us and brings us joy and happiness. And memories is a great thing to start to think about in terms of, if I spend my money on this, what memory is it going to create for me and my family? What is this going to be something that we recall over Christmas dinner in 10 years' time and have a really good conversation about it? That's the kind of thing you want to spend your money on. But also be really comfortable in the way that we know that time will work for us and against us in retirement. So, those first 10 or 15 years of retirement between the ages of, say, 55 and 60 through to 75, are the most important. That's when time and health is on your side. That's when you should be spending your money the most and the hardest, because all of the research and data that's now out there suggests that spending falls over the lifetime of retirement, suggests that there are some big spending drops when you get into your mid-70s and mid-80s, if you're lucky enough to get there. And then all the research then says that if you do make it into your mid-70s with a pot of money, you're probably going to start accumulating again, and you'll end up at age 85 with potentially only spent 30 to 40% of your starting net wealth. And I look at all these numbers that are coming out, and it just seems to me a bit of a tragedy, right? It's kind of, you work so hard for so long to put yourself in a position to have freedom and have the ability to enjoy your money. And people have not learned how to enjoy their money in a way that gives them that freedom. So I think, you know, when you talk about practical steps, identify things that give you that are experiences and memories. And there are good ways to kind of segment your money and name it and give it purpose and give it meaning to be able to support that kind of spending.
You know what, I think about this quite a lot, and I think the most practical step I took is reading a book. And that book wasn't a book on financial planning or psychology. It was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, on Memento Mori, right?
Yeah.
And a reminder on a regular basis of you are this went from quite a fun conversation to quite a depressing one, right? Remember you're going to die. And actually, in our conversation, remember that health isn't guaranteed at that later in our life. It's such a practical reminder to make us think, what with our health at a premium and our lives at a premium, what should we do to make the most of that time? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely agree. Again, I'll answer the question, but just to kind of say, look, that, you know, I think the whole longevity thing has been rammed down people's throats, quite rightly in some ways, right? Yeah, we're living longer, but actually those numbers are skewed somewhat by kind of an increase in child mortality, right? Or a decrease. So, you know, children aren't dying as young as they once were, which has increased the top end. So, you know, the numbers are a bit spurious, but health span is very different to lifespan. Our health span hasn't really moved that much in the last 50 or 60 years as a species. You know, when, you know, someone born today has a healthy life expectancy of about 60 years, right? They might live for 85, but they've got healthy life expectancy of about 60 to 62 years. And I looked at the stats that actually, because I'm writing something about it. Again, you know, someone who's hit anyone between the ages of 55 and 65 has got between 10 and 15 years of healthy life left before you end up just living. It doesn't mean you're, like, you know, decrepit. It doesn't mean that you're disabled. It doesn't mean you can't do much, but you can't do a lot. So the sense of reality that we need to make sure that we know that, we might be living longer, but our want, desire, physical and mental capabilities to be able to do some of the things that we want to do will decrease with age. So I think it's so important to understand that healthy, that healthy bit. And I break retirement down into 3 phases, right? I mean, go years, go slow years, no-go years is something that gets bandied about. I've developed this thing where I call it's like exploring, nesting, and reflecting, right? So you've got your exploring years, those kind of really important years. You've got your nesting years where things become a little bit more homely, time in the garden, time with grandchildren, etc. And then you've got those years where you'll just be reflecting on stuff. That would, you know, and I think it's really important to take advantage of those exploring years, both from an energy, a time, and a money point of view.
Yeah, 100%. And I think actually the more memories you've got in the reflecting years, the better. But you may not be experiencing them in that stage of your life. But the more you can fit in the previous stages, the better for that. I'm going to give you a magic wand, Dan, in this part of the interview. I'm going to give you this magic wand, and if you could wave this magic wand and get everybody is world too ambitious? We'll use world. Let's use UK. To understand one thing about the next chapter in their lives as they approach their 50s, 60s and beyond, what would it be?
I think it would be and I'll back this statement up, that people have the best opportunity they have ever had to live a life that they want to live.
Yeah.
And I'll back that up by saying that at no point in your life have you accumulated as much wisdom and knowledge as you have in your 50s and 60s. And that wisdom and knowledge about what you do like and what you don't like should be the foundation to take advantage of the freedom that you have. And I kind of talk about these three phases, right? If we think about before we go to work, childhood and school, you have freedom, but you don't have any wisdom, right? You don't, you haven't learned anything. You go to work.
Particularly at my school, it was shocking.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. You're not learning about life, are you? You know what I mean? You haven't got any wisdom. You've not got any accumulated wisdom. And then you go to work, and then you're kind of, what I would say, you're constrained, but you're earning and learning, right?
Yeah.
And then you get this part of life, you're now free with wisdom. That is, at no point in anyone's life have they collected that amount of knowledge and wisdom and the ability to have an amount of freedom to use it wisely. So that's what I would make sure everyone understands, the opportunity that sits in front of them, and then make sure they understand that they need to do the work on themselves to take full advantage of that opportunity.
It's a bit of a challenge for me when I'm thinking about this, though, because that element of those three parts of our lives, the learn, the earn, and the stop, I think actually is a bit of a definition of retirement for an industrial age. Do you think that definition works today as we enter in this new world that none of us know what's going to look like in the next 20 years, or even is empowering for people who are retiring, whatever that looks like today? What do you think? Do you think we need to redefine retirement to make it different in a way?
Yeah, I mean, retirement is a man-made industrial age thing, right? I mean, I think learn and earn still happen, as we know. Yeah. But it's not stopped, right? That's why I say you've got, wisdom and freedom to now go, do you know what you could go and go, right, I've done all this work as, I will give you an example, right? I worked with a really successful Met Police guy who was very high up in the Met Police, worked there since he was 20, so done his 30-year service by the time he was 50. And in the last 10 years he was very high up in crowd management and conflict resolution. And he said the skills that he's learned in that he thinks are really important for children to learn in a modern society. How can because he was like, children don't have the resilience that they once had. We need to kind of so he set up his own little business where he never got paid a bean because he didn't need to go into schools and give talks and workshops about how to build resilience and how to deal with conflicts. And you kind of think, well, he's taken all of his accumulated wisdom. He is still technically working, just, he's disassociated money with work, which everyone needs to do at that point, right? So he's got purpose, he's doing work, he's got, and that to me is the definition of what the second half of life looks like. What happens next. Use that stuff, give back. If it means it pays you, great. If it means it doesn't because you don't have to, even better. But continue to grow and learn and contribute and give back. It isn't a time to withdraw. And so, that's the bit that needs to kind of be really redefined.
When you were talking about it, then the phrase that came into my head is learn, earn, and don't retch, choose. Just make it a choice in terms of what you want to do. It's really, really interesting. I know that you've written on the blog, on your blog, about the mental health impact of retirement. What do we need to think about when we're thinking about our own mental health when we're transitioning into whatever's next in our lives?
Yeah, I mentioned the depression stat, which is quite startling, right? There's lots of stats out there that, that talk about the impact of this phase of life on our mental health, the impact of loss, etc. So I think we need to understand that relationships is a key predictor of our happiness and longevity. And there's, again, the Harvard study and all other studies that talk about that. So if we lose relationships and don't build new ones, that's going to have a massive impact on our mental health. And so what we need to really understand is that we are more likely to suffer with our mental health during this transition. And I think one of those reasons is that this part of life actually shines a spotlight on good and bad things. If you've got a bad relationship with sleep or alcohol or something else, then this part of your life, if not worked out, will shine a really big light on that. If you've got a good relationship with other things, like you love to work out or you love to spend time with friends, it's going to shine a really positive light on that, because you're going to be able to do more of it and feel freer to do more of it, right? You could go to the gym at 10 o'clock, not worrying about having to get back and answer your emails. So you're going to feel, freer to do so. So I think that's the big thing about why it affects our mental health, and actually why we need to be really conscious to pay bigger attention to what we are going to do with our time and who we're going to spend it with. I talk to a lot of people about, creating a bit of a stop doing list. Who are the people that you don't want to spend time with? Yeah. What are the things that you don't want to do? What are the things that suck away your energy and make you feel a bit down, right? Don't do that stuff, because it will be highlighted more and more and more. And so you need to prune stuff away that doesn't really allow you to grow.
I also think it's worth thinking about how relationships are going to change if you're leaving work. So, our experience with working with a few clients, not everybody, because everybody's different, but a few clients, their social lives were intrinsically connected to what they did every day. And actually, when they left work, the dynamic of the social relationships changed. Yeah. And it's really interesting, because I've probably been guilty of this in my life, and I've had to really make an effort to nurture. Scott Galloway's got this great phrase on this when he talks about it: useless friends, where he says, actually, for me, it's playing paddle tennis, or doing other, like, just going for a curry once a month, but finding connections that aren't about the work, so that when the work dynamic potentially changes, those friends and those relationships dynamic doesn't change as much. Yeah, and I think particularly for men, and not all of us are rubbish, I am, particularly for men, and more difficult as we get older, just maintain a bit more effort on that sort of stuff is really important to do.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. I think that's, it's I mean, I've experienced, again, not with everybody, but I've definitely experienced it where it shocked people on the downside, how quickly work relationships get cut off when they've left work. There's a thought process that these work relationships are quite strong, and we'll all continue to meet up once a week or once every 2 weeks or once a month and go for a beer and a curry, and it don't happen. There's no intention either side, and it's, because work has forced that. It doesn't mean they're not your friend.
No fault of anybody's, right?
Exactly.
Like the dynamic's different now.
Exactly.
Yeah. So interesting. I as I say, I've got through a chunk of the book. I'm really excited about reading the rest. But one thing we talk about quite a lot is, and we've sort of we've considered it when it comes to the financial plan before, is that incremental change. So instead of having it all worked out, knowing that part of the next stage of our life is likely to be a series of experiments. Explore a little bit about that for me, and how that potentially applies when we're thinking about the next stage.
Yeah, I love that phrase. I think the more that we can get used to that, like little experiments, micro steps, I think, there isn't, I like people setting goals, but I also don't like goals, because in a way that goals are often set too far out. They're often too big, and people don't map the journey to get there and get disappointed when they're not quite reaching them. or reach them and have this really kind of empty void sense after getting there, right? So I think understanding that it's a journey to navigate and to take micro steps. I do think one of the challenges I see with, and I love the way you frame that, Chris. I think one of the challenges I see with people retiring for people that are retiring, is actually sometimes the way that we work with them. And I say because I don't know exactly how you work, but if you create cash flow plans for a 60-year-old that shows 40 years of cash flow, and there's obviously every good reason why we would plan someone up to age 100, I think it creates the wrong focus and wrong behaviors a little bit, because it might be, oh, damn, but I'm running out of money at age 97. That's bad, isn't it? There's like red in the plan. And I'm like, well, no, it's fine. And you kind of, there's the focus gets taken away. So what I really love to do, it's important to think of the long term, but it's even more important to start planning in 3 and 5 year blocks. I think 5 years is probably the maximum that we should go out to make any type of concrete-ish plans about what we want to do and how we want to do it. But I talk to people in their late 50s that are going, can we put some planning in for care fees when we're age 87 and that? And I'm like, well, I mean, we can, but like, it's like I get it, but what is it going to show you? What are we trying to show you? It's and I think there's just a bit of a conditioning with people that there's too much long-term focus on this phase of life, when it should be a series of experiments. We don't really know what we like. We should be finding out a lot more about what we don't like. Annie Duke's book, called Quit, is brilliant. Let's figure out stuff, and actually don't be ashamed to try something and say, I don't want to do that anymore. Go and try paddle tennis and go, I don't like that. Go and try bowls. I don't really like that. Go and take up golf. Oh, I love that. Go and, do wine. And you've got an opportunity to do all these experiments, figure out stuff, and you don't need to get it right from day one. In fact, don't ever try and get it right. Just keep trying.
Yeah. You know what it's like, Dan? You're really good at asking questions of other people, and then when it comes to your own life, you've still got to learn the skills. At least that's been my experience anyway.
I talk about builder's house all the time. That's my favorite.
I was having some coaching the other day with my coach, and she used a phrase that was brilliant, because I had to go, right, this is what I want to get done. This is what I want to achieve. She went, well, how about just holding it a bit more lightly? And I was like, oh, shit. That's what I talk to people about all the time. I need to sort of take that advice. And holding stuff lightly and accepting that if it works, great. But if it doesn't, it's not the end of the world. I think is not a bad way to approach this next chapter of our life. What do you think?
Yeah, I hate success and failure. I hate binary outcomes, right? And I think that's the problem with a lot of financial plans as well, actually, retirement plans. It's kind of, there's a success or failure outcome. And it isn't that, is it? No. It's kind of like, I've said this before in a room full of financial advisors, and it got a little bit of a breath intake, but I was like, listen, a financial plan with 100% success rate is a financial plan that's going to 100% fail, right? I mean, people are looking for this success, but it doesn't. There is no success or failure. There's just learning. There's navigation. There's twists and turns.
It's also a conversation about spending a bit more money, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely, right. It's kind of like, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's like, someone will go, oh, it's been a really good year for my investments. It's been really successful, isn't it? I'm like, yeah, but you're not spent it. So, what are we? Yeah. So, everyone's interpretation is different. But I think if we can get over that binary outcome, and you just go, do you know what? The choice that we made at that time was right.
I think is a really interesting concept. that you've talked about today is that concept of memory dividend.
Yeah.
What if we're looking at a year, can we turn around and go, that was a good year on generating memories? I think that's an interesting concept. And is that how we measure whatever success looks like for us in a way that actually improves our well-being versus how much our investments have grown, which really, it's an interesting one.
Yeah.
I've loved this, Dan, and I felt I didn't get through any of my questions, and I felt that
we had a few. I think we got
a few. We had a
Yeah.
few. We did all right.
We did ward each other that it probably wouldn't go to plan, right? I mean,
look, we said that plans don't go to plan, and this one didn't, right? It was a good conversation.
Exactly.
Where can people find out a little bit more about you, a little bit more about the book, and a little bit more about the work you do?
Yeah, so I'm the only social media platform I'm on. Well, I think I'm on others, but I've got kind of profiles that are 20 years out of date. Is LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn. I post quite a lot on there. My website, Humans versus Retirement, humansvsretirement.com, is where my podcast sits. Links to the book. I do a lot of sketching. And all of that stuff. So they're the places to check it out. I've got my weekly newsletter that I send out, etc. So that's all on the website to go and check.
One last question. I'm finding that producing the videos and writing the book and doing and having some great conversations with people has really clarified my thoughts on this sort of stuff. How's that journey of becoming an author been for you?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, right? I think that, I had a conversation with someone this morning who, another financial planner who's writing a book, and they just wanted to pick my brains about what I did. And they said, how long did it take you to write? And I said, well, there was two answers, really. I said, officially, it took me about 4 months to pull together, but I've been writing it for the last 7 years. And I said, what was really cathartic to me was that I managed to look through a lot of the work that I'd done, conversations that I'd had, both on my podcast, both with people I'd met through the work that I'd done, client work, and all of that, and bring it into one bit. And I think there's probably 2 or 3 other books that might come out of, or whatever it might look like. But that was an amazing process because, like we have many conversations with clients, many conversations with our peers, many conversations with other experts. And, sometimes those conversations get a bit lost in the whole other thing. You have so many different nuggets and etc. So it was an amazing process to go through to kind of put it all down into it. And then, we all like a little bit of stroking every now and again. And I think just to kind of get it validated from people like yourself and other authors that I've respected and clients, and that going, actually, Dan, this is, really good. This is the stuff that we've been. And so it's lovely, right? It gives you the energy to keep going because there's a lot of work to be done to help people at this.
I think what we're trying to do with What Happens Next, and the feel that I get from this book already is, I think it's really interesting how my motivations change from the days when I had to pay the bills, so I had to make a living, I had to build a business, to a real perception of, okay, what does purpose of meaning mean to me now? And it's far more about positive impact. And I know your book is going to have a huge positive impact. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for joining me today. It's been amazing.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate the conversation. Thank